where I've got an overview of maybe one of the least known but most important anti-federalist essays. This one written anonymously, observations on the new Constitution written anonymously by what we could call America's first female historian, Mercy Otis Warren. And she had 18 main objections to the Constitution, but she grounded her entire case in the principles of the American Revolution in opposition to centralized, consolidated power. I'm going to highlight some of the juiciest warnings. You can, of course, read the whole thing. It's a pretty long one, especially where the one where she predicts everything would lead to an uncontrolled despotism. But let's kick it off here, right from her, well, if I can find my notes here, right from the first sentence. She says, mankind may amuse themselves with theoretic systems of liberty and trace its social and moral effects on sciences, virtue, industry, and every improvement of which the human mind is capable. But we can only discern its true value by the practical and wretched effects of slavery. And thus dreadfully will they be realized when the inhabitants of the eastern states are dragging out a miserable existence only on the gleanings of their fields, and the southern, blessed with a softer and more fertile climate, are languishing in hopeless poverty. She's saying, okay, when this type of scenario, when we are living that, they're going to ask, when asked, what has become of the flower of their crop and the rich produce of their farms? They may answer in the hapless style of the man of La Mancha. The exigencies of government require that the collectors of the revenue should transmit it to the federal city. And I'm pretty sure this is a reference to Don Quixote, published in the early 17th century. Not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. In other words, don't live in some kind of crazy fantasy land, but in reality, the reality that you're going to live in is going to be all power and wealth will end in the federal city, the center. She continues. She said, animated with the firmest zeal for the interest, she was a playwright, and she wrote very poetically. So she said, animated with the firmest zeal for the interest of this country, the peace and union of the American states, and the freedom and happiness of a people who have made the most costly sacrifices in the cause of liberty. Again, pointing right to the revolution and the sacrifices that were made for liberty. She says, who have braved the power of Britain, weathered the convulsions of war, and waded through the blood of friends and foes to establish their independence and to support the freedom of the human mind. I cannot silently witness this degradation without calling on them before they are compelled to blush at their own servitude and to turn back their languid eyes on their lost liberties, to consider that the character of nations generally changes at the moment of revolution. So she's really highlighting, she's like stirring up emotions, especially for people who lived through the revolution or their family lived through the revolution or lost people through the revolution. Hey, we went through quite a bit. We lost a lot and we sacrificed a great deal. For what? And that's what we have to think about. Is liberty the primary object, or is it something else? And she continues focusing on the right of self-defense, and she keeps hitting on natural rights, which I think is pretty awesome. She said, self-defense is a primary law of nature, which no subsequent law of society can abolish. And of course, self-defense is not just individual self-defense. It's not just defending your person and your property against maybe criminals down the street. It's not only self-defense against foreign invasions, but it's also self-defense of people with power in your own governments. And you have to defend yourself against, well, their machinations. And she said, the immediate gift of the Creator, so this right of self-defense, this natural right, this is a gift, but you don't just sit there and not use it. She's saying you gotta stand up for what you believe in. She said, the immediate gift of the Creator obliges everyone to remonstrate against the strides of ambition and a wanton lust of domination, and to resist the first approaches of tyranny. Don't wait until it gets stuck in and try to fix it later on. She was, as we'll see here in this episode, she was not too happy with the Massachusetts ratification, where she was from, Massachusetts ratification of the Constitution, where instead of saying we won't ratify until we get the amendments we want in advance, we'll go ahead and do it on a gentleman's agreement, and you will promise to do the right thing later on. She didn't trust that. So she said, you have to resist the first approaches of tyranny. Don't let it gain hold. Take a stand against it now. She said, which at this day threaten to sweep away the rights for which the brave sons of America have fought with a heroism scarcely paralleled even in ancient republics. So I wanted to go through quite a bit of these early excerpts at the top of her paper because it really sets the stage for how she's approaching her view of the Constitution. If you're viewing the Constitution as, well, we're just creating a new strong government, she was on board with creating a stronger central or general government than what they had under the Articles of Confederation, just like most of the anti-federalists. But she thought there were too many ambiguities. She thought it went too far, too much mixing of power. We'll get to a little bit more on the details on that. But if you're going to form a system of government, which of course was part of the Lee Resolution in July of 1776, was it June of, well, whenever it passed, it called to create a system of government. It called to create the Declaration of Independence. If you're going to create that based out of, well, we got away from this certain government, you really want to focus on those first principles. And here from Constitution Center, they describe it like this. Warren viewed the Constitution from the perspective of the spirit of 76, the original animating principles of the Revolution, and explained in vivid poetic prose, which you just got a little taste of, hopefully I did it justice, why the proposed system of government posed much the same threat to American liberty as the British government once had. So she would say, like, look, why are we replicating the same thing here? She saw it that way. She said, they write, there was a tragic irony here. As Warren saw it, the same population that had risked their lives to escape distant, centralized tyranny now appeared willing, a mere decade later, to settle for much the same at home. And here from T.J. Martinell, we published an article from him with a little pinch hit, a little bit from Mike Meharry, worked with him on this as well. Giving an overview of Mercy's great paper. We published that over the weekend. And he writes, her chief worry was that the Constitution would abandon the principles of the Revolution and facilitate consolidation, centralization of power of the states under a powerful national government rather than one of general powers for delegated and reserved purposes. Delegated purposes, everything else reserved. In other words, it would lead to unlimited centralized power, similar to the system the colonists had fought to leave. We know that at least a handful of people in the Philadelphia Convention, she wasn't happy with the fact that it was in secret, but we know after the fact that at least a handful of those people there were proposing federal power in all cases whatsoever, which is unlimited centralized power, which is a replication, in fact, the exact same language that was used in the Declaratory Act by the British in 1766. They claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So she understood, maybe through close confidants, she was friends with many, what was going on or what she was concerned with. She said, the ratification of a constitution, which by the undefined meaning of some parts and the ambiguities of expression in others, is dangerously adapted to the purposes of an immediate aristocratic tyranny, that from the difficulty, if not impracticability of its operation, must soon terminate in the most uncontrolled despotism. So she's, hitting on a few things right here. First of all, there's some general and vague terms. And speaking of general, things like general welfare. She didn't get into all the specifics of what there were, but she's like, you are using very vague language, which can be manipulated by people in power. Certainly John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, probably the father of the Articles of Confederation as well. He had pointed out back in 1767, one of the leading principles of the Revolution was understanding that all artful rulers, which is probably redundant, who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits, would always try to give their efforts as much semblance of legality as possible. That's my paraphrase of it. It's probably relatively close. But in other words, government people will always try to expand their power, but they'll always claim that it's legal. So if you have any undefined or kind of hard to understand terms, then that's going to be much easier for them. And even though many of the Federalists were able to clearly explain what certain phrases in the Constitution, necessary and proper, general welfare, regulate commerce, what they were to mean in law at the time, Many of the anti-federalists, and here you can see from Mercy Otis Warren, were concerned, well, not everyone's always going to understand this, and we know how people with power treat this stuff. They're going to try to expand it, and that's part of why it would result in the most uncontrolled despotism. Now, maybe that's not how we describe what we live under today, but we certainly live under the largest government in the history of the planet, and it's not even close. The largest, most powerful ever. And if that's not uncontrolled despotism, it certainly is well on its way. Now, first, a little background about Mercy Otis Warren that I think is kind of interesting, and it kind of explains a little bit of where she's coming from. She was a descendant of a Mayflower passenger and a Mayflower compact signer named Edward Doty. Her father was a judge, a representative in Massachusetts, and actually a very early outspoken opponent of the British government and Governor Hutchinson in Massachusetts. There was a lot of conflict between the Otis family and the Hutchinsons. So it's no surprise that he and her older brother, James Otis Jr., who you might be familiar with, were, quote, raised in the midst of revolutionary ideals. And here from Wikipedia, which actually, I don't know, they're not always awesome, but here, this is a pretty decent overview. Although Mercy had no formal education, she studied with the Reverend John Russell, who was actually her uncle, while he tutored her brothers Joseph and James in preparation for college. I think Russell actually went to Yale, from what I remember reading. So this is a highly educated guy. She was tutoring James Otis Jr. and her brother Joseph Otis, who I don't really know much about, but also she studied with him as well, and she had access to his library, and he encouraged her to study. This was unusual at the time. Most she was born in 1728, so most women at the time were just literate, and they didn't go much further than that. They didn't dive into the classics like Mercy did, but she was encouraged to do this not only by her uncle, her brother, who went to Harvard, but here they say her father also had unconventional views of his daughter's education, and as he fully supported her endeavors, which was extremely unusual for the 18th century. Man, if more parents had done that at that time, how much faster the American Revolution probably would have been resolved in a positive favor. But here, an interesting thing on James Otis Sr., who I've never talked about on this show, but I don't know too much history about him, but this is a really interesting piece. He was the presiding justice of the Barnstable County Court of Common Pleas during the September 27th, 1774 protest against the British Intolerable Acts. I mean, here's an example of Wiki being kind of not complete. The Intolerable Acts, this is the coercive acts, is really the term. No one called them Intolerable Acts at the time, but that's cool. He agreed to ignore the requirements of the Parliament's new legislation and so preserved for the area the large measure of self-government that Massachusetts had enjoyed under its 1691 charter. Whoa, so this is kind of an early nullification in the Otis family. Here's a judge saying, well, we're going to ignore what Parliament passed. And so this is the kind of mentality that Mercy Otis Warren, Mercy Otis, James Otis Jr. grew up in. And so it's no surprise they were such revolutionary leaders. And Mercy eventually meets her brother's roommate while her brother's at Harvard. This is James Warren, who was also a Mayflower descendant. And after marrying him after a 6-year engagement, and because he was really involved in the local provincial government, their home became a meeting place for local politics and revolutionaries, including the Sons of Liberty. So she started becoming a host, really, to all the revolutionary thought leaders in Boston. And they write here at Wiki, Warren became increasingly drawn to political activism, and she hosted protest meetings in her home. So she organized these things. These meetings laid the foundation for the committees of correspondence, which she wrote about later in her great History of the American Revolution. Quote, perhaps no single step contributed so much to cement the union of the colonies and the final acquisition of independence as the establishment of committees of correspondence. Open communication about problems they were facing and strategies to defeat them was, to Mercy Otis Warren, the great historian of the American Revolution, at least at that point, was one of the most important parts of it. Now, she ended up becoming, through this whole process, she became a very close correspondent in letters and even a personal advisor to many of the patriot leaders of the Revolution, people like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, George and Martha Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and especially John and Abigail Adams. There's a lot of back and forth between Abigail and these important other leaders, between Mercy Otis Warren, who we don't cover enough. And I covered a lot of her work during the Revolution in an episode almost a couple of years ago. Conscience, so we've often called her various different terms. She's been called the conscience of the American Revolution, the muse of the American Revolution, the first lady of the American Revolution, America's first historian. This will be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Let's get back to Mercy's writing here in Observations on the New Constitution. This was published sometime in the spring of 1788. I'm not 100% sure the exact date. I've never been able to find it. So sometime around there. But here she is again talking about natural rights. This is a big focus for her, is the natural rights of the people. She said, all writers, well, back then maybe, not now, all writers on government agree, and the feelings of the human mind witness the truth of these political axioms, that man is born free and possessed of certain unalienable rights, that government is instituted for the protection, safety, and happiness of the people, and not for the profit, honor, or private interest of any man, family, or class of men. So again, focusing on natural rights, citing things that were very familiar to people from the Declaration of Independence, motivating them to think about what are we creating here. And she reminds everyone that the origin of all power is in the people, and they have an incontestable right to check the creatures of their own creation. Of course, many of the Federalists were saying, you got to ram this through. We're the experts. I mean, we hear the same kind of thing today. We're the experts on government. You should just listen to these people because they know what it is. And you lower class people, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You need to accept this because this is going to be good for you. And she's like, look, it doesn't matter what class anyone is in, what level they are. The people are the origin of all power, and they are our servants. So we can do whatever the hell we want with whatever you propose. Anyways, she goes a little bit further here. She says, and if certain select bodies of men, here she is highlighting this idea, deputed on these principles, man, sometimes I struggle over words because I learned them from reading, determined contrary to the wishes and expectations of their constituents, the people have an undoubted right to reject their decision. So if the people who are put in there as agents of the people come up with something, the people have a right to reject it. Again, a kind of a precursor to the nullification strategy we use today. Of course, we know that the people rejected the Stamp Act. There was the people's nullification of the Stamp Act. If you've read Murray Rothbard on this, or Dave Benner for the 10th Amendment Center, he has written a great article on this. I've covered it in an episode. We know that the people rejected the Stamp Act on these same types of principles. And so she's like, they have an undoubted right to do this, to reject their decisions, to call for a revision of their conduct, to depute others in their room, or if they think proper, to demand further time for deliberation on matters of the greatest moment. Again, she's saying, whoa, why are we rushing into this? Let's slow this down. The fear-mongering actually did come from the Federalists, especially early on, very aggressively. Like, if we do not accept this now, we're going to have absolute chaos, especially because of the rebellion, the Shays Rebellion. We got to get things under control because we are falling apart. The rest of the world is going to come and invade us. We are just really, really on the verge of complete collapse. And many of the anti-federalists were like, okay, we even agree with you that something needs to be done. But on the other hand, some of them would say things like, and again, this is my paraphrase, basically, look, we just came out of a insanely expensive and costly war. We got to understand that things are not going to be super smooth right off the bat. But you know what? We're doing pretty decent under the consideration, under the circumstances. Either way, Mercy Otis Warren is specifically saying we should slow down. We saw very similar arguments by the anti-federalist Cato, who was responding, who first in his first paper said, look, let's just take our time and look at this. And Alexander Hamilton most likely responded with a couple of papers signed as Caesar, of course, because Alexander Hamilton loved a dictator. And he said, like, look, if you guys don't accept it how it is and quickly, we're going to shove it down your throats with a military force. So take it or leave it. And so that didn't go over too well. And of course, Mercy Otis Warren months later is taking the same approach. Slow it down. Otherwise, we're going to fall prey to those, quote, who are endeavoring by all the arts of insinuation and influence to betray the people of the United States into an acceptance of a most complicated system of government, marked on the one side with the dark, secret, and profound intrigues of the statesman long practiced in the puerile of despotism. I mean, she's really laying into him here, basically saying, this was a secret thing? We weren't even, and she gets into one of her complaints about this, is like, we were only expecting amendments to the Constitution, or to the Articles of Confederation, their Constitution at the time, not a whole new system. How the heck did we end up with this? Here back to T.J. Martinell. He said, Warren also prophetically anticipated that once states accepted the new federal government under the Constitution, there was no getting out of it. So she actually warned that if you accept this system as is, and of course, she was a leading proponent of adding a Bill of Rights, but it wasn't just saying we need a Bill of Rights. There were structural things that she was opposed to as well. But she's like, look, if we accept this, there's no getting out. And we've seen people try to get out, and what happened? So that's not to say that that is indissoluble, as she called it, but here's how she put it. They, the proponents, wish to see the Confederated States bound together by the most indissoluble union, but without renouncing their several sovereignties and independence and becoming tributaries to a consolidated fabric of aristocratic tyranny. Again, tyranny, aristocrat, rule by elites, rule by a small number, improper representation. And here from the Library of Congress, the secret muse of the Bill of Rights, they write, she urged states to reject or postpone hearings on ratification. Just slow the process down. Let's take our time. There is no rushing into such a huge change of what we're under. The dramatic arguments had an impact on citizens concerned about ratification, and observations on the new Constitution became an influential work amongst anti-federalists. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but they didn't know that Otis Warren wrote this document for about a century. They also always thought it was Elbridge Gerry who wrote it, and they attacked him for that. And maybe this was done on purpose because maybe it wasn't a woman's place or something to make these types of commentaries, although she was well known for some of her poetry during the Revolution. But this was written anonymously. It was only a descendant some years later, about a century later, who determined it was her. But anyways, Otis Warren's pamphlet, this is again the Library of Congress, was reprinted in newspapers across several states, so it was influential on the anti-federalist thought at that time. In the state of New York, anti-federalists enthusiastically printed and distributed 1,700 copies of her observations on the new Constitution as a counter to the 500 copies that had been distributed of the ratification-supporting Federalist paper. So 3 times the amount of printouts of her work reached more people than the 500 of the Federalist Papers. I often call the Federalist Papers way overblown in response to understanding the original legal meaning of the Constitution, because it was primarily during the ratification debates. Because if we understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution to be what the people understood it to be, the people who gave it legal force, those are the ratifiers, and then you have to understand what influenced their thought or their views during the ratification debates. And the Federalist was not really published outside the state of New York during ratification, very much at all. Otis Warren's was primarily published in New York, but it was distributed out through a number of other states as well. Anyways, all this stuff is going to be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Alan Mosley does an awesome job organizing all the blog posts for these episodes. He includes all the links that I'm mentioning. I mean, I give him some notes to work with, so he just gets that organized. Plus, he uploads video to all the other platforms that don't allow us to live stream. But of course, he'll have links to all the live stream platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, Odyssey, LinkedIn, X, etc., and all the audio-only podcast platforms will be there as well. And then I'll get that published in a couple of hours here over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment, taking a little breather from Otis Warren. I want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I haven't even been here for every single one since day one. There's Sheraton Farmer in Missouri. Rights are not tradition. I love that screen name. Haji 1954, Kirk Morrison, Dixie. Yeah, because if you think about it, what if the tradition is anti-rights? And then if your rights are only based on that tradition, then you don't actually have natural rights. It's just based on what other people approve. And that says a lot. Haji is here, Kirk Morrison, Dixie Strong, Jamie, Ken, R.C. Andrews, good to see you. He is citing one of her great poems during the Revolution. And everyone else. There's John Rame, Sonny Bono, Mr. Greenbottle, Howard, and a few others. I know I'm skipping over a few people, but I got a lot of info here, and I want to get back to this. Please do continue leaving comments, especially in the archive, once the video is archived, because that does help trigger platforms, the mainstream platforms, their algorithm, and tells them to show us to more people. Also, smashing the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts and any other podcast platform, all that stuff does help us spread the word. So thank you very much for giving me a hand on that. Anyways, let's get back. So this is a wholly new type of system. Mercy is pointing out. We've never seen this type of a system. They couldn't even come up with a name for it. And she's not happy about that. She said, the most sagacious advocates for the party have not by fair discussion and rational argumentation evinced the necessity of adopting this many-headed monster of such motley mixture that its enemies cannot trace a feature of Democratic or Republican extract. So she's saying the opponents of this can't understand what actually type of government this is. Nor, she said, have its friends the courage to denominate a monarchy, an aristocracy, or an oligarchy. She was concerned it would end in an oligarchy. Thomas Jefferson didn't at first, but some years later, he said, if you believe that federal judges are the final and complete and ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions, you are supporting the despotism of an oligarchy, a handful of people making decisions for millions and millions of people. But anyway, so she said, Jefferson was a big fan of Mercy Otis Warren, nor have its friends the courage to denominate a monarchy, an aristocracy, or an oligarchy, and the favored bantling must have passed through the short period of its existence without a name, had not Mr. Wilson, James Wilson, State House Yard speech, always, there's many of the anti-federalists, they always point to Mr. Wilson specifically. He was probably, in my mind, the most influential Federalist, even though we always cite the Federalist Papers. His State House Yard speech really kind of started the discussion of what the Federalist position was, and you can actually trace back, and maybe he was getting his arguments from other people, but I think many of the anti-Federalists saw him as incredibly influential on what the Federalist framing was. So it's fascinating to see her mention him by name here as well. And because she talks about someone else later, but doesn't mention a name, but specifically Wilson. And the favored bantling must have passed through the short period of its existence without a name, had not Mr. Wilson, in the fertility of his genius, suggested the happy epithet of a federal republic. So this is a wholly new type of system. She's like, what is this thing? No one can name it. They just came up with a new one. Thank you, Mr. Wilson, you're genius. But this is a lot of problems. And here she now goes into all of her various objections. And she had a lot of problems. I'm not going to highlight all 18 of them. Some of them overlap to some degree. But she had a lot of problems with the system of elections. She actually wanted annual elections. This is very similar to what George Mason wanted in 1774, 1775. They thought that you had to keep going through the vote the bums out process. She also wanted either term limits or a rotation. I've covered this elsewhere. Rotation is not the same as term limits. They were basically saying maybe you can serve 2 years, but you have to go back for one before you can come back. Always sending them back to the people to live under the stuff that they tried to enact. That was one of the thought processes in the anti-federalist views. Mercy Otis Warren said that as well, and here's what she said. There is no provision for a rotation, nor anything to prevent the perpetuity of office in the same hands for life, which by a little well-timed bribery. Well, I mean, prophetic here. She understood, well, not prophetic, really, just a student of history. If you understand how politics works, it's dirty. It's filled with bribery and corruption and handshakes and deals and back scratching and lobbying, whatever you want to call it. But she understood what would happen. And it wouldn't take too much to keep these people in office for life, even if you had elections every couple of years. She said, which by little well-timed bribery will probably be done to the exclusion of men of the best abilities from their share in the offices of government. By this neglect, we lose the advantages of that check to the overbearing insolence of office, which by rendering him ineligible at certain periods, that's a rotation she preferred, keeps the mind of man in equilibrio and teaches him the feelings of the governed, and better qualities qualifies him to govern in his turn. So she wanted annual elections. She wanted a rotation, which is, in the same category as term limits, although she didn't say that. She also thought that one representative to 30,000 inhabitants, she said, is a very inadequate representation. Some people like Cato and Brutus and others said it's impossible to have representation when you have so many people to each representative. They can't. They're just kind of guessing, and they're only representing a small people. She also thought the electoral college was too small. It needed way more members, because if you're going to have representation of the people in the states choosing who's going to be the executive, then, well, more than just 10 people or 2 people or whatever it is on a state-by-state basis was not enough. And she was also very concerned about the Senate. She said, this again ties into elections and how often they're in office. She said a Senate chosen for 6 years will in most instances be an appointment for life. So she understood that even though you could go back to the people of this, here at the time it was the state legislatures, even if you could go back to them and the people would put pressure on the state legislature, she expected, even under the system before the 17th Amendment, that they would be in office for life. And she was probably pretty prophetic on that as well. And she said the result of that means a branch of the Supreme Legislature, thus set beyond all responsibility. If they're going to be there for life, they have no one to answer to. And so therefore, she said, this is totally repugnant to every principle of a free government. And just as a quick side note, I thought of it this morning. I did an episode about the anti-federalist objections to the structure of the Senate over a century before the 17th Amendment. So even if I know a lot of people, friends of the 10th Amendment Center, always say, we got to get rid of the 17th Amendment, and that'll make things way better. But the anti-federalists thought even without the 17th Amendment, the Senate would end up as an imperial body. And this is what Otis Warren is getting at as well. That'll be linked to in the show notes, the Imperial Senate, Anti-Federalist Warnings. Again, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. She was not a fan of the judiciary. Neither was Elbridge Gerry, who everyone thought wrote this. Maybe this is why. She said there are no well-defined limits of the judiciary powers. They seem to be left as a boundless ocean. This is well before the incorporation doctrine. You imagine what she would think if the federal judiciary were able to decide on everything, state, federal, everything was a federal issue. She would have gone nuts about this. Because even at the time, this was, to her, a boundless ocean of power that is broken over the chart of the supreme lawgiver. Quote, thus far shall thou go, and go no further. And as they cannot be comprehended by the clearest capacity, what are those judicial powers? What do those cases and controversies mean? She's saying, like, look, maybe this is legal terminology, but this is somewhere that it's kind of ambiguous and people are going to have trouble understanding this, and that means they will not be able to keep their government in check. That's kind of the warning here. Or the most sagacious mind, it would be an Herculean labor to attempt to describe the dangers with which they are replete. So she's kind of going into some generalizations here. She was very concerned about too much blended power between the various branches, not enough separation of powers. The anti-federalists certainly repeatedly cited the celebrated Montesquieu, who said there's no liberty if you have consolidation of power. The Federalists said, well, he didn't mean everything had to be completely separated. They could be kind of blended and not count as consolidation. The anti-federalists disagreed, and Otis Warren points out as well. She said, the executive and the legislative are so dangerously blended as to give just cause of alarm, and everything relative thereto is couched in such ambiguous terms. Again, ambiguous terms. When Benjamin Franklin submitted his first proposal for an Articles of Confederation in 1775, a year before the Declaration of Independence, this was actually before the shot heard round the world in April, he shopped it around to people in the Confederation Congress. He shopped it around, and Thomas Jefferson took a look at it, and he put some notes in the margin in his handwriting. And one of the things that Jefferson wrote was general welfare. He said such an ambiguous term should not be used in a document of this importance. I did not find anything when he was writing back and forth from France saying the same about the Constitution for the United States some years later. Maybe he lost his concern about that, but at least at that point. And so Otis Warren, I think, also had this same type of position, whether she read Franklin's document or not. I wouldn't be surprised if she had. So she's saying it's all couched in ambiguous terms. I know I keep focusing on general welfare, but necessary and proper is another one as well. This is the legal doctrine of principles and incidents, which is very clear on what it means, but necessary and proper has been redefined by the federal government to mean convenient and whatever the hell we want. He said, this is, well, I should go back here. Everything is couched in such ambiguous terms, she wrote, in such vague and indefinite expression, as is a sufficient ground without any objection for the reprobation of a system that the authors dare not hazard to a clear investigation. This is why they want to rush us through this, she's saying, because if we look at it closely and spend some time, we're going to see that just this in and of itself, it needs to be rejected. Now, T.J. Martinell points out that anyone familiar with anti-federalist writing will find common rhetoric in her attacks on the notion of a standing army. This is just super common. She said, standing armies have been the nursery of vice and the bane of liberty, from the Roman legions to the establishment of the artful Ximenes, and from the ruin of the Cortes of Spain. John Dickinson talked about the Cortes of Spain giving emergency funding. And he wrote about this in 1767, a history lesson about how they gave emergency funding for the king to keep this a standing army, even without going to the legislature for funding. And they said he could just do it on his own. And he said that was the end of their freedom as soon as they gave him that emergency power. He said she goes to the planting of the British cohorts in the capitals of America. So we know that standing armies were in the capitals of America. She's calling on these histories of standing armies to say, well, this has been the nursery of vice and the bane of liberty. And she points out that the militia is no longer fully under the authority of the people of the states. There's partial authority in the federal government under the new Constitution. And she predicted that, quote, the militia may be sent into foreign countries for the fulfillment of treaties stipulated by the president and 2/3 of the Senate. Man, she really, really called it there. Everyone was saying, no way are they going to use the militia overseas or in other countries. And we know there was some resistance to try to send militia into Canada some years later, but she definitely called that as well. She was also a supporter of a precursor to the 10th Amendment. Now, she may have been happy with the amendments that were suggested by the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. She just didn't like the fact that they ratified without getting them first. And here she says there is no provision by a Bill of Rights to guard against the dangerous encroachments of power in too many instances to be named. So this is 9th and 10th Amendment, all on board with that type of a principle. All powers not delegated are automatically reserved to the people. She said, we are told by a gentleman. Here she is not naming someone here because she called out Mr. Wilson, so maybe she didn't like James Wilson, but she's not specifically calling out James Bowdoin in Massachusetts in the ratified debates here. But she says, we are told by a gentleman of too much virtue and real probity to suspect he has a design to deceive. Quote, the whole Constitution is a declaration of rights. That's how James Bowdoin put it in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, saying we don't need a Bill of Rights because, well, none of these powers that we're talking about reserving, none of these powers, these things these rights that we want to list out, none of them are delegated to them to touch on anyway. So there's no point in that. And this is a very similar, and this is what got me thinking again about what date was this published, because that was in January of 1788, and then in May of 1788, Alexander Hamilton repeats that message. And I'm not sure if this was after Mercy or before, but he said, this was in Federalist 84. The truth is, after all the declamations we have heard, that the Constitution is itself, in every rational sense and to every useful purpose, a Bill of Rights. And there's not a lot of places where I agree with Hamilton, and maybe he was just making this point to just get what he wanted because he was such a flip-flopper. But I think this is a very powerful point, that if they hadn't been delegated power to do something, then they don't have that power, and everything else is automatically reserved anyways. But Mercy said, even despite that, this stuff is so important. The natural right of self-defense, of course. The right of self-defense is the primary law of nature she's talking about. They're so important that we shouldn't mess around. She said, but mankind must think for themselves. And to many very judicious and discerning characters, the whole Constitution, with very few exceptions, appears to be a perversion of the rights of particular states and of private citizens. So she's saying, look, it's actually the other way around. She's a little bit more hardcore than I guess I was leading into there. She's saying, no, it's not a declaration of rights. It's a perversion of rights. And this is an example of how, well, we often hear from people, especially in the libertarian world, states don't have rights, only people do. The term states' rights is just a misnomer. Well, rights as far as individual rights, correct. But the founding generation often referred or used the word rights and powers interchangeably. So sometimes they could say rights, meaning individual rights. Sometimes they could say rights reserved to the states, meaning powers reserved to the states. And then you can see Mercy Otis Warren doing that here as well. But she goes on talking about the rights of individuals ought to be the primary object of all government and cannot be too securely guarded by the most explicit declarations in their favor. So even though she's talking about powers delegated and reserved, we're concerned that the whole system is a perversion of that. But she then focuses on individual rights, and she keeps coming back to the size and scope and power of the government. And T.J. Martinell points out that she argued that the territory making up the United States was just too vast to be administered by a single government. She writes, the difficulty, if not impracticability, of exercising the equal and equitable powers of government by a single legislature over an extent of territory that reaches from the Mississippi to the Western Lakes and from them to the Atlantic Ocean is an insuperable objection to the adoption of the new system. And she also complained, just like Federal Farmer, I mentioned this in a recent episode on Federal Farmer. Well, I'm going to pick back up on his essays in the near future. But she pointed out, look, no one had any idea. She said, not even the most distant idea that when they appointed people for a convention, that there was going to be a totally new system rather than amendments to the Articles of Confederation and a new consolidated system instead. And this is kind of the arts and intrigues that she keeps pointing to. But then after going through 18 different things, and I'm only highlighting a handful of them, she says, there's even more. I can't even cover it all. There's so much to deal with. She says, but it is needless to enumerate other instances in which the proposed Constitution appears contradictory to the first principles which ought to govern mankind. And it is equally so to inquire into the motives that induced to so bold a step as the annihilation of the independence and sovereignty of the 13 distinct states, the final authority of the people of the several states. She said they are but too obvious through the whole progress of the business. From the first shutting up the doors of the Federal Convention, she did not like that it was held in secret and you couldn't understand or you wouldn't know what people were saying. And she said, and resolving that no member should correspond with gentlemen in the different states on the subject under discussion, till the trivial proposition of recommending a few amendments was artfully ushered into the Convention of Massachusetts. I mean, they were pretty solid amendments that they recommend there, but she was saying, look, this is really the wrong approach. Patrick Henry was one of the other very, very outspoken anti-federalists who are saying, look, we don't need to just have a deal that we're going to get amendments. I don't trust how this is going to play out. He was not happy, along with Richard Henry Lee, with the amendments that they ended up getting, and maybe that was part of the warning. T.J. Martinell points out that her conclusion is as bittersweet as it is far-sighted in its perspective. I know I'm going long here, but this is a good piece that I want to leave you guys with. If, after all, on a dispassionate and fair discussion, the people generally give their voice for a voluntary dereliction of their privileges, let every individual who chooses the active scenes of life strive to support the peace and unanimity of his country, though every other blessing may expire. Still, you want peace and the people together, even though you give up everything else. Maybe that's not awesome. But she says, and while the statesman is plotting for power and the courtier practicing the arts of dissimulation without check, while the rapacious are growing rich by oppression and fortune throwing her gifts into the lap of fools, let the sublimer characters, the philosophic lovers of freedom, who have wept over her exit, retire to the calm shades of contemplation. There they may look down with pity on the inconsistency of human nature, the revolutions of states, the rise of kingdoms, and the fall of empires. Man, I think this is just really awesome stuff. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed putting this together and sharing it with you and TJ's article and all the other stuff in today's episode. If you want to help us get this kind of history lesson out to more and more people, and then all the other work we do to apply these historical principles to standing up for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government likes it or not today, nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month of that dirty government fiat over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, since I'm running late here, I'll take a look at the chat a little bit later today or tomorrow. I'll get so many great ideas for future episodes, and I appreciate all your comments and feedback wherever you may do that. You can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.